Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. COVID-19 aside, there are few factors able to influence the global economy as significantly as the relationship between its two biggest players, the United States and China. You only need to look at the trade dispute during the Trump administration to understand the global ramifications of any tensions. I wanted to get an idea of what to expect in the near future, in particular, the risk to financial markets. Gerwin Bell is the lead economist for Asia on the Global Macroeconomic Research team at PGIM Fixed Income. PGIM Fixed Income is a leading provider of global fixed income solutions with almost $1 trillion in total assets under management. It's part of PGIM's global multi-manager model, which is one of the largest asset managers in the world with about $1.5 trillion in total assets under management. Gerwin Bell has some impressive credentials, having joined PGIM Fixed Income from the International Monetary Fund, where he was mission chief in their European department. He joins me this morning from the US. Gerwin, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hi, Sean. Thanks very much for having me. That was really quite an impressive introduction.
Impressive guest is how I'd put it. Now tell me, do financial markets fully appreciate the risk or the level of risk at the moment in the relationship between China and the US?
I'm going to give you a yes and no answer. I think financial markets appreciate or probably overappreciate some of the risks, and those are primarily related to the trade dispute. If you read the headlines right now, there's going to be a delegation visit of either remote or in person to talk about the phase one and potential phase two deal. And we know this has gone up and down, and financial markets have become quite capable of pricing this. But I think that's actually the least important aspect of the entire China-US change in relations that we're seeing currently getting underway. And the other aspects I don't think are sufficiently priced at all. I mean, the closest that we have seen financial markets pricing it is the executive order on some of the Chinese corporates delisting or having to delist in New York. But I mean, there's a whole geopolitical aspect of tech integration and also geopolitical risk at least in the Pacific and the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. And I don't see, first I see it as very difficult to price, but I also see it not as being a bit complacent about the risks that they're kind of steadily building.
It's interesting you say that because from Australia's viewpoint, you're talking about two aspects. There's the trade aspect and pricing risk there, and then geopolitical. Because Australia is removed from that, we think much more, I would argue, about the geopolitical risks between the two countries, and particularly because China's in our region, than we do about the trade, because obviously US-China trade doesn't directly affect Australia. I suppose that if there is a trade tussle, so sticking with that one first, does everyone lose? And if there is a trade deal, does everyone win?
Well, I'm as orthodox an economist as you can find, and I would say yes, everybody wins in a freer trade, and you lose once you start restricting trade in general. Everybody knows there are some exceptions to this rule in theory, but I think in general it applies. So certainly there's some sectors in the US that have lost from this trade dispute. You only need to ask importers of certain steel products. They find it very difficult to compete. There are certain places in China that have lost from the export restrictions. So everybody on the trade side has lost somewhat. Now, we need to keep this in perspective. This was not the greatest trade war in the history of the world. And the Chinese also have done some work on let the exchange rate adjust to take most of the bite away from the tariffs. But it is certainly something where, in a measurable context, the US economy would be better off if there wasn't a trade war or trade restrictions, and so would the Chinese economy in principle.
Gerwin, stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. Gerwin Bell is the lead economist for Asia at PGIM Fixed Income. Then shifting to the geopolitical side, how big an issue is that? Can you put that in a historical context? Are the two countries at a worse place now than they've been in 20 years, or is it just something that comes and goes?
That's a great way of phrasing the question. So what we have seen is clearly a China on the ascent and a very, very fast per capita income growth. I mean, the likes of which the economic history, certainly for a large country like China, has never seen. At the same time, there have been worries over the decline of, American exceptionalism. I remember when I was in graduate school, a history professor in the university wrote this big book in the late 80s, The Decline of Great Nations. And there was a big doom and gloom already. It hasn't turned out like this even 30, 40 years later. But there is a certain sense of shift in the great global power base to something that has never happened before. I will nuance this a bit. First nuance is that the ascent of China is truly remarkable, yes, in the last 150 years. But if we go back further, and that is certainly the perspective that Chinese leadership have, if we go back 300, 400, 500 years, China was the world's largest economy. And they just, by virtue of misgovernance by emperors or whatever, missed the train on the Industrial Revolution and then suffered colonialism and other ill feats, and were in a decline that did not arrest until Deng Xiaoping actually started the reform process. Since then, China is catching up to past glory. So that, in my mind, is a positive view. So it's not that we have a country surging to the global forefront that doesn't have the institutions to deal with a rather advanced economy. I'm not really worried that the US are losing much of global leadership. And one key indication is that Americans talk so much about it. So a complacent person would not talk about them about to lose leadership. That's probably a Panglossian way of looking at the global picture going forward. Unless you're European, that is a region that is probably, by virtue of any number of things, not going to be the third most important, if at least. Now, what always happens when you get, several new powers into the fore, it's something that political scientists call the Thucydides trap, where, there's a potential misunderstanding between the leading power and the ascending power, and we get into misunderstandings, miscalibrations. And the key example there is my home country, the Wilhelminian Empire, where Germany adopted such an aggressive stance that in the end we went into World War I. So that's the risk that some people have in mind. But I would push back against that. Some instances, the diplomatic finesse might be Wilhelminian, but certainly there is no ambition to have territorial expansion like the colonial Germany had. There's also no ambition to really be the leading force in the world, but there is ambition to get regional prominence and influence commensurate with what China sees as its proper standing of hundreds of years ago. And that will create tensions.
There certainly are regional tensions around South China Sea, Taiwan, and it wouldn't be that difficult to make an argument that they actually do have colonial-style ambitions in some of those areas. What do you think of that?
Yes, that comes from the 7-dash line in the South China Sea. Yes, but I see this more. The problem is one that the other countries there are not maybe sharing the same favorable view of Chinese history. And it's also been a traditional space that's been allied with the United States. So we do get this type of confrontation there.
So bringing that to Australia, and we are a middle power in the region. On the trade side, we've been harmed because of, tariffs on things like wine and restrictions on barley, coal, some of our big exports. Geopolitically, China sees us very much in the US camp, which we are. Hard to argue against that. The thing about the US-China thing is that there are sort of casualties on the sideline sometimes, and we're not talking militarily, but certainly economically, Australia could suffer as a result of that tension between the US and China. And then India, Japan, lots of those Southeast Asian nations could also be thrown into that category as well, I suspect.
There's this African proverb, right, that says, when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. Now, I'm not going to say that Australia is the grass, but there'd be negative implications for non-giants. But it's also important to sort of unpack these issues a bit. On the trade side, it makes a difference that a lot of Australia's exports are commodities. Now, commodities are a highly tradable good. In other words, there's a world market, and if you don't supply the Chinese markets because the Chinese are replacing, say, Australian imports with Indonesian imports, then, Australia can then export to the markets that the Indonesian exporters are now no longer serving. And we've seen actually some of this with the American soybean exporters, which, were shut out of China. Then even before the phase one deal kind of brought them back on, they could export elsewhere. And I've recently seen a chart that something similar happens to, for instance, barley exports from Australia, which seem to have found quite a market in Saudi Arabia. So trade diversion, of course, also always has frictions. Now, commodities are probably the easiest place to deal with, but even when it comes to much more specialized goods, there's a limit to how much these trade wars or boycotts can really matter. And the case in point there is the recent boycotts that happened from China with respect to Korean exports after the deployment of the theater high altitude defense system, and with Japan over the island chains. In both cases was the consumer boycott of Japanese products, but it turns out they're actually not that substitutable. So after a rather short while, the boycott was rather unceremoniously dumped, and these goods came back. So it's bad to be drawn up in it. I don't want to belittle it, but if you really boycott and cut yourself off from key suppliers, you might be the ones who suffer.
We'll be back with more in a moment. My guest this morning is Gerwin Bell, lead economist for Asia at PGIM Fixed Income. One area I just do want to talk to you about is technology and how that relationship between US and China will play out. Huawei being the biggest name, at least out of China. I think places like Tesla, who are now engaging much more with Chinese officials and regulators than they ever did before. The whole technology space, and for Australia, this has real implications because things like lithium and rare earths, which we mine and sort of are an alternative to supply chain from China, so it does flow down to Australia, some of this stuff. Where do you think that whole debate on technology will go between those two superpowers?
Yeah, just before I get there, the rare earth bit is actually really, really interesting. And the improvement and resumption of Australian rare earth exports actually are due to a Chinese rare export ban to Japan. And then the Japanese just developed a mine in Australia. And indeed, rare earth is really quite the misnomer. That stuff is not rare. It's just difficult to extract. Yes. And, it's pretty much present everywhere in the world. So what the Chinese are risking is higher prices and domestic underemployment of resources and a rare earth industry coming up somewhere else, and notably in Australia and the US, we actually have a lot of them. So that's just the rare earth. But I think the rare earth misunderstanding and misperceptions are quite illustrative for the more general misperception of this entire technology sphere. So to just give you my view in a nutshell, the US and Western countries are still far at the forefront of key technology. China is nowhere near. Secondly, China needs productivity growth. Because as 2 days ago, we saw the population census showing a much greater than expected prospective decline in working age population. We know from studies, for instance, done by the National Monetary Fund that productivity levels in China are still very, very low compared to international standards and certainly compared to the global technology frontier. So China needs technology. So the US has abundant technology, and China needs them. Now, the interesting bit is the next step. What lessons are being drawn? The lessons being drawn, I think, are on both sides are not the correct ones. The Chinese draw the lesson that the government needs to now foster technology in key areas as identified by government. China has gone that way down before. They have spent a huge amount in building a solar panel industry that essentially commoditized heretofore high-tech industry. So solar panels now deal as commodities. A similar thing is underway with artificial intelligence, like lower performance microchips, all areas where China has really eked out a bit market share, but no pricing power and really not that much innovation. What would help China, though, and again, that's a study that the International Monetary Fund did, is more market-based allocation of resources and capital to better uses. A key obstacle there, as ever, and certainly identified over the last 20 years, is the continued dominance of state-owned enterprises in many parts of the economy. And that is something that every Chinese economic reformer, as high as the prime minister, Li Keqiang is an economic reformer. He's the prime minister. His deputy, Liu He, is a key economic reformer who keeps on telling us that it's absolutely important to get SOE reform going. And yet it's stalling time and time again. So it's not so much that the lesson is to have government commoditize yet another technology sector, but the question is, why hasn't the past efforts really worked? So that's the issue with China. And of course, China trying to build and buy high technology then triggers a response in the US where they say, well, we don't really want to give our technological goods to our global competitor. Now, the mistake the US are making, I think, is that they look to the Chinese model as something that's actually to be emulated, notwithstanding the failures the government-driven and innovation drive has actually led. So I see a lot of talk in the US about rebuilding a chip industry. I mean, it's not really clear that this will do anything positive for productivity growth or even economic growth in the US.
It's a fascinating discussion, but we are out of time. Gerwin, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
That was Gerwin Bell, lead economist for Asia at PGIM Fixed Income. This is a Fear and Greed daily interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.